Going on. Today's video is going to be about showing you how to play Left 4 Dead 2 in every single mode in the game. Now, this is a game that's been out for 15 years, and so you might already know how to play it, but there's a lot that people don't know, and I'm going to show you exactly what you don't know today. So first, if you want to play on controller, make sure you press X right away, /A right away. Alright, so here's the main menu. You can play Campaign, Mutation, Realism, Versus, Realism Versus, Survival, Scavenge. You can play the campaign mode, mutation, realism, versus, realism versus, survival. You can play the scavenge mode. You can play the campaign, cooperative, mutation, realism, versus, realism versus. You can play survival. You can also play scavenge. Then you can play the campaign mode, mutation, realism versus, there's also scavenge mode, and there's also survival. And you can play campaign, mutation, realism versus, survival, and a scavenge mode. But don't forget about the campaign, mutation, realism versus, survival, and the scavenge mode. And if you play the campaign, you can play campaign, but you can also play mutation and realism versus. The survival mode, you can hold out in the survival mode. You can play scavenge mode with survivors or the infected. You can play campaign, mutation, realism versus. You can play the survival mode and hold out. You can play scavenger mode. You can play campaign, mutation, realism versus, survival mode, scavenge mode. You can play the campaign. You can also play the mutation, but there's also the realism mode, the realism versus. You can play survival. You can also play scavenge, and you can play the campaign. You can play mutation, realism versus, survival mode, and the scavenge mode. And that's pretty much every mode that you can play in the game. Now, sometimes you might be able to go down here and look at the add-on section, and you might be able to find a few add-ons that you can play. And if you want to access them, the way you do it is you play campaign, mutation. You can play them on realism. You can play them on realism versus. You can play them on survival. You can play them on scavenger as a scavenger mode. You can play them on the campaign. You can also play them on mutation and realism. And you can play the versus, realism versus. You can play the survival mode. You can also play the add-ons on the scavenger mode and the campaign. And that's about it. Now, if you want to quit the game, you're going to have to go down here and press the quit. And you can find the quit it's actually quite funny. You can find the quit option on the campaign. You can find it on mutation, on realism, on versus, on realism versus, on the survival mode, on the scavenger mode, scavenge. You can also find it in the cooperative campaign mode, mutation, realism versus, survival, scavenge, and the campaign. So all of those modes you can find the quit button, and that's how you're going to get out of the game. Now, if you want to get out of the game on the campaign mode, you just have to go all the way down. If you want to get out of the game on the mutation mode, you got to go all the way down. If you want to get out of the game on the realism mode, you got to go all the way down. If you want to get out of the game on versus, you're going to have to go all the way down. And the next one, there's no other way around it. If you want to get out of the game, quit the game on realism versus, you're going to have to go all the way down. If you want to go to survival mode and quit the game, you have to go all the way down. Now, if you want to go to the scavenger mode and you want to quit the game, you're going to have to go all the way down. And then you go back to the campaign mode and you press quit. Now, sometimes it won't work on the controller if you're using a controller. So if you want to use a mouse and keyboard, you can use it, and you can click on campaign. You can click on mutation. You can click on realism. You can click on versus. You can click on realism versus. You can click on survival. You can click on scavenger mode. You can click on the cooperative campaign. You can also click on the mutation. And on the realism and the versus, You can click on it on Realism Versus, or you can click on it on Survival and Scavenge. Now, there's also achievements for this game. Well, you know, you get achievements by playing the game in all the different modes. So the modes that are eligible for achievements are Campaign, Mutation, Realism, Versus, Realism Versus. You can get achievements on Survival. You can get the achievements on Scavenge mode. You also can get the achievements on Campaign, Mutation. You can get them in the Realism Apocalypse, Realism mode. You can get them in the Versus mode, in the Realism Versus mode. You can get them in Survival. You can get them in Scavenge. And finally, the last mode that you can get them in is the last one, is the Campaign, the Cooperative Campaign. Now, you can also access plenty of options within this game. Like most other games, you can access options. But the good thing about Left 4 Dead 2 is that you can access the options in every single mode. I'm going to tell you which ones you can access them on. You can access the options on Campaign, Mutation, Realism, Versus, Realism Versus, Survival mode, and Scavenger mode. But the thing is, they're also accessible on the Cooperative Campaign, on the Mutation. They're accessible in Realism, in Versus. Realism Versus, you can click options on Realism Versus. You can get to the options in Survival. You can get to the options in Scavenger mode. And the last mode, and this might be the last mode. I think you can. There's probably even more. No, there's more. You can get options on Campaign. You can get them on Mutation. Also, I forgot. You can also get them on Realism. You can access the options on the Versus mode. You can also access them in Realism Versus and in Survival mode. And you can also access the options in Scavenger mode. Last thing about Left 4 Dead 2, well, this is actually one of the last things in Left 4 Dead 2 is not the add-ons, the extras. And a lot of times they have developer commentary or the credits. So each mode has its own developer commentary section and credits section. You can access those sections on each one of these modes, on the Campaign, on Mutation, on Realism, on Versus, on Realism Versus. You can access them on Survival mode. You can access them on Scavenger mode. You also can access them on Campaign, on Mutation, on Realism, and on the Versus mode, on Realism Versus. You also can, the extras, like the developer commentary and the credits, also in Survival mode, and Scavenger mode, and then finally, obviously, Cooperative Campaign. Now, they do have a blog post here, but if you click on that, it might actually take you out of the game, when in reality, you want to be reading the blog post as you're playing each one of these modes. And there's a blog post in every single one of these modes. I'm not going to click on it because, like I said, it will take me out of the game and I'm trying to play it. But you can access that blog post on the Campaign mode, on the Mutation, on Realism, on the Versus, on the Realism Versus mode, on Survival. You also can access that blog post on Scavenge mode, on the Campaign, on the Mutation, on the Realism Apocalypse. You can access the blog post on the Versus section, in the Realism Versus. You also can access them in the Survival section. You can get to that blog post in Scavenger mode. You also can get to that blog post very easily in the Cooperative Campaign. You can find that blog post in Mutation. You might be able to find it in Realism. You can find it on Versus and Realism Versus. The blog post will be available in Survival mode. It also will be readily accessible to you to read on Scavenger mode. You can find the blog post very easily, read it in its entirety on the Campaign mode, on Mutation, on Realism, and in the Versus, in the Realism Versus. You also can read that blog post, and if you want to take some notes down, you easily can do that on Survival mode, on Scavenger mode. You can find it in the Campaign section very easily. Mutation, Realism. Realism actually will give you a real way to look at the blog post. Now, if you want to read the blog post in Versus, fine by me, fine by the game too, because it makes it available for you. You can read blog post in Versus, Realism Versus, Survival mode, Scavenger mode. You also have access to that blog post in the entire Cooperative Campaign online. You don't have to be playing single player. You can play online and read that blog post. You also can read it on Mutation, Realism, Versus, Realism Versus, Survival mode, Scavenger mode, and the campaign, the cooperative campaign. But sometimes you don't want to play this game cooperatively online. I completely understand that. Well, so does Left 4 Dead 2. The developers, Valve, the team behind the game, they also understand that you might not want to play this game online. Completely understandable. Guess what? You can read that blog post when you're playing single player. You also can read it single player mutation. Realism, single player. You can read that. Versus, well, Versus, you can't really play single player. It's online, so that'd be the one thing you can't, but you can read the blog post either way. You can read it in Realism Versus. You can read it single player or survival. You can read it in scavenger mode, but that's not really single player. You're gonna have to be online for that one. And then campaign, cooperative edition, mutation, realism versus, survival, scavenge mode, campaign edition. Now, all of these options / gameplay features are available for you in Left 4 Dead 2. And just as a quick recap, I'm going to go over every single one of these modes that you can play very quickly. It won't take me too long at all. You can play campaign. You can play mutation. You can play realism. You can play the versus. You can play realism versus. You can play survival. You can play scavenge mode. You can play campaign. You can play mutation. You can play realism versus. Realism versus, survival edition. You can play the scavenger mode. You can easily access campaign, mutation, realism versus, You can play survival mode and hold out for as long as you can. You can play scavenger mode. You can play the campaign. You can play mutation, realism versus, survival, scavenger mode, campaign. You can also play mutation, realism versus, survival mode edition with the game. You can play scavenge mode in the game. This game allows you to play the campaign, mutation, realism versus, survival, and scavenge mode. And then to end it off, it's you play with the campaign. And that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this very quick tutorial on how to play Left 4 Dead 2. All the options available for you. All the game modes available, such as campaign, mutation, realism versus, survival, scavenge, campaign, mutation, realism versus. You can play scavenge mode. You also can play survival and scavenge mode in the campaign. And that's going to be about it. So thanks for watching so much. Make sure you press quick game. If you don't press quick game, like I said, you can press it on the controller. It might not work. Quick game, and you're back to where you were. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.